Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. We are midway through the second quarter of Historathon, so it's time for another Historathon book tag. This time with prompts focusing on cultures that existed between 500 and 1500 in the Common Era. Now, some historians, particularly those in Europe, will refer to these as the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, but in other places it was a Golden Age. So let's dive into these prompts. First up, we have the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. So name a book that has a title or a first sentence that is a lie. I'm gonna go with a book that does both. The Good Soldier by Ford Madox Ford. The first sentence is, "This is the saddest story I ever heard," which is ridiculous. Regards to John Dowell, the narrator, regards to Edward Ashburnham, the titular good soldier. This is not the saddest story I've ever heard, nor ever read. In some cases, it's quite boring. This is a book about wealthy couples from the UK and the US who are vacationing in spa towns in Europe and frustrated as they try to engage in affairs. It's not a particularly sad story, especially when Ford Madox Ford was also writing a book, Parade's End, that deals with the absolute horrors of the First World War, which occurred right after this book would have been set. Prompt 2, the Mayans. Now, the Mayans are famous for their well-developed calendar. So my question is this: which month of the year is your favorite month for reading? What month do you look forward to every year, knowing that the reading experience that month is just going to be incredible? For me, it's December. Now, part of that is because I get some vacation time because the schools close. And so I get a lot of reading done in December, but there's part of it that's just special. It's nighttime earlier here in the Northern Hemisphere, so I'm able to read, with the lights on around me, and in particular, with the Christmas lights on, and reading in that way, getting in the chair, perhaps, now with my daughters or my wife, reading as well in the same room. There's just this special atmosphere around it that I look forward to every single year. So that's my favorite month for reading. Prompt 3, the Pāla Empire. Now, the Pāla Empire was really the last major Buddhist power on the Indian subcontinent, and the Indian subcontinent is the birthplace of Buddhism. And this was really the last time where there was a Buddhist culture flourishing in its homeland. So name a book that marks the end of an era, or a writer who marks the end of an era. Well, I have two. One is the great poet, Persian poet, Hafiz. Now, Hafiz is not the last great Persian poet, but there's a sense in which he marks the last great development in Persian poetry. He comes in the aftermath of Persian poets who have developed historical epic poetry or deeply religious poetry, Sa'di's ethical, moral poetry. And here with Hafiz, we have lyric poetry that sort of reaches it's the last development in some ways for classical Persian poetry. And so after Hafiz, the other poets are picking one of those genres and sort of just working within it. But he's just an absolute master. Another one, though, would be the great playwright Christopher Marlowe. Now, Marlowe has some incredible lines in Tamburlaine or in The Jew of Malta, or particularly in Dr. Faustus. And yet there's something about his plays which showcase poetry, showcase these declaiming overstriders who aren't really characters that develop. They exist as these almost Promethean characters who overstride and get a comeuppance at the end, a fall from grace. There's not a lot of development. And that, of course, would all change a few short years later when William Shakespeare showed up. And he had characters who developed, who had this inward interiority, this reflective nature. They didn't just look at everything as what was fated to happen, but as something that they were agents within. And so Marlowe marks the end of that era and the birth of this deep interior psychological literature that we love and appreciate so much now. Prompt 4, the Vikings. Whose library on BookTube would you want to raid? Now, I've got two libraries I'd be interested in. One is Sean D. Stanfast's library because he has so much nonfiction. He has all these works on film, on art, on archaeology, on early music, and I would find all of that very fascinating. But if I was only allowed one box, I'd be popping down into the southeastern US. I'd be visiting Noah at Everyone Who Reads It Must Converse, because I'd be taking his entire copy of the Zohar. So, whose library on BookTube do you want to raid? Prompt 5, the Inca Empire. Now, the Inca Empire in South America was up on the Andes Mountains, at high altitude. There's demonstrations around how the physiology of the natives among the Inca Empire had differences in terms of how they could breathe and their lungs worked. So here's a question. What's a work or a writer who's the pinnacle of its genre? Now, when I think of cultural ethnography, when I think of anthropology, I think of Zora Neale Hurston, and in particular, Mules and Men, because there she has this personal nature to her writing. It's personalized nonfiction, but she is going deep into what is happening, what is happening culturally, what is happening in terms of the stories that are told, what is happening in terms of the food, the dances, all of that. And it's written so fluidly and it's wrapped together so well. The other creative nonfiction, historical nonfiction, historical fiction fusion that I love would be Memory of Fire by Eduardo Galeano. I've never read anything quite like this. There are aspects of it that are history drawn directly from primary sources. There are aspects of it that are an essay. There are aspects of it that are clearly imagined with historical personages that are developed and quoted, but also fictitiously developed. But Galeano has a masterpiece here in the Memory of Fire trilogy. I cannot recommend it highly enough. And he really works to give voice to the native peoples of the Americas. Prompt 6, the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, this truly was a culture that led to the golden age of Islam. Baghdad and the education centers there in Baghdad were flourishing during this time. It was truly like a place where astronomy, science, medicine, mathematics were all advancing in fascinating ways. So, who is your favorite writer of science or popular science or the natural sciences, mathematics? Now, for a long time for me, this would have been Stephen Jay Gould for a long time. But more recently, I've been reading Loren Eiseley. I've been reading these volumes that the Library of America published. And his essays are just astounding. I cannot recommend these highly enough. He's such an entertaining writer. He's such a curious writer. And that shows on the page in the best way possible. So for me, right now, it's Loren Eiseley. Now, for prompt 7, Byzantium. Now, Byzantium had some of the most complex legal systems, courts, and hierarchies imaginable. So name a book that you couldn't stop reading, despite it being so confusing. 2 books came to mind. Now, one was the Phantasmagoria, that is Faust Part 2 by Goethe. Faust Part 1 is very famous, but Faust Part 2 is a whole world apart. Here is a fever dream. The vocabulary is enhanced. It's not about tragic character development. It is just this explosion of language, exploration of symbolism, themes, and it is a masterpiece. The other one that I would mention, though, would be J.R. by William Gaddis. Now, I read this in my very early 20s, and I had never read anything like it. Almost the entire book was just dialogue, and it wasn't clear who was speaking. So it was trying to catch on, okay, the few times we get hints about who's speaking, how do we note that that person's dialogue or speech is different? What are the little inflections, the repeated motifs, phrases, the characteristics of that character's speech, to be able to identify them and then keep track of them across the course of 600 pages. It is a maze of a novel, and yet it is absolutely hilarious. Highly recommend that one. All right, so what are books that were confusing, but you absolutely loved them? Now, prompt 8, this gets into the theme of Historathon, and I'm going to go with the Song Dynasty of China, because I want to know a culture that existed between 500 and 1500 in the Common Era that you're interested in learning more about, and why? Well, for me, it is the Song Dynasty, in large part because this is a culture I don't know much about. I've been learning more about it. I haven't been able to find an entire book on it. Please recommend one if you know of one. But I've been reading articles and essays about this as I've been reading The Outlaws of the Marsh or The Water Margin or All Men Are Brothers by Shi Nian. And this is this massive 2,000-page series of episodic adventures that do deal with these ultimately tragic characters and adventurers in the Song Dynasty around Mount Yang, I believe is where it's called. And it's an incredible book. And as I'm learning from the book about the culture, I'm also trying to learn from a nonfiction perspective about this culture as well. So what's a culture you're interested in learning about from this period? Prompt 9, the Mali Empire, one of the great empires of Africa during this time. So name a book that helps readers appreciate the cultural heritage of Africa. So I've got a couple that I would recommend. One would be sort of the foundational epic about the Mali Empire, the Sundiata. Bamba Suso and Bana Kanut give different versions as Gambian singers about the great, hero Sundiata, who helps act as a general to help found the Mali Empire. But this is a really interesting African epic, and the ways in which it diverges from what we think of as epics in a European sense or in an Asian sense is just really fascinating and cool. It's a heck of a story too. Now, more modern works, I would recommend Okot Pibitek, who's a Ugandan poet, and he has the Song of the Vino and then the Song of Okot. And these are two long poems that show a husband and wife in their relationship and sort of singing about their relationship, about their lives, and about their interaction together. It's just a really, really incredible poem. Probably maybe the single best sort of poet, pure poet from Africa that I've read. And then the other would be the great Bessie Head with Meru. I think this is a book that gets into the heart of South Central Africa, with certain ideas there around culture, around the ways that coastal Africans and Africans who live more inland interact with each other and view each other, the way that men and women interact, and the relationship between art and identity as well. And this is just an absolutely incredible short novel I cannot recommend highly enough. So what is your, the book that sort of exposes a reader to culture in Africa? And then prompt 10. Now anytime I do one of these, I'm going to be ending with this type of question. So I'm going with the Merovingians. This was a pre-Carolingian dynasty in France. Ultimately, the Holy Roman Empire would come out of that Carolingian dynasty, but the Merovingians. Name your favorite pop culture reference for a culture from this period. Well, I'm going with the Merovingian from The Matrix Reloaded. That's not a great film. It's not a bad film, but it's not a great film. But the Merovingian is one heck of a character. And his whole philosophy around cause and fatalism versus free will. Really, really interesting dynamite for 5 minutes in that film. For a musical reference, though, I'm going with Rick Wakeman, King Arthur and his Knights. And I'll link that in the description box. Now I am going to tag a few folks. Several of them are Historathon hosts. So I'm going to be tagging Vin over at Revenant Reads, Brian MR, Gareth Howells, Mark over at Book Time with Elvis, Peg at the History Shelf, Bill Rutenberg at the Rutenberg Library, whose library would be maybe next on my Viking raids. And then I'll tag a few other folks. Aaron Foster, I want to tag Brian over at Bookish, who was such a great history teacher for so many years. I'm going to tag Jen at Remembered Reads because she reads so broadly. I would love to hear her responses to some of these prompts. And then finally, I'll tag a new booktuber, Aaron Hook. I recommend you subscribe to him. So, hope everybody's doing well. Thanks.